film has been around nearly as long as the motion picture itself. Through the decades, these films and their makers have used many different techniques to induce fear, terror, and panic from their audiences. From using the viewer's imagination to cutting-edge visual effects, the way these emotions are elicited have evolved. But one thing that has not changed is the fact that most humans enjoy experiencing terror in a safe and controlled environment. And the horror genre of motion pictures has delivered just that. Let's take a look at how this genre began and how it's progressed over the years. The first horror films were much like the fright books and novels that were being wrote at the time. They were gothic in style, set in spooky old castles or dark, foggy locations such as cemeteries or swamps. The very first horror movie was Georges Méliès' Le Manoir du Diable in 1896. By today's standard, it wouldn't have been much of a film, being only a short 2 minutes long. It was not until 1911 that the world received its first full-length horror movie, Notre Dame de Paris, or The Hunchback of Notre Dame as it's better known in the States. Just a fun fact, the most portrayed villain of the horror genre, according to the Guinness Book of Records, came from this Gothic era of film. Dracula holds this record with over 200 portrayals. When color made its way into the film scene, it brought with it a more accurate way to display blood and gore for horror movies. While two-strip Technicolor had its drawbacks, it still added an edge for filmmakers. And in 1932, Michael Cortez took advantage of this new technology. His film, Dr. X, was the first horror film to be shot in color. Also, the 1930s was when zombies first staggered their way into Hollywood. They were first shown to film audiences in Victor Halperin's low-budget, independent film, White Zombie. This film was actually inspired by a short-lived Broadway play, Zombie. By the time the 1960s rolled around, the restrictive Hays Code had virtually disappeared and there was much less film censorship. This opened many doors for directors, allowing them to branch out into directions with the genre that had maybe previously been out of limits. Horror films began to depict horror and terror in ordinary, innocent-seeming locations and everyday situations. This is also the time that we began to see directors that we now consider to be masters of the genre. My personal favorite among them being the master of suspense, Alfred Hitchcock, with his classics such as Psycho and The Birds. Another of these masters is George Romero, who brought the horror genre out of Transylvania and into rural America with his masterpiece, Night of the Living Dead, in 1968. In the 1970s, there was an onslaught of serial killer and slasher movies on the big screen. John Carpenter's Halloween was released in 1978. It's seen many sequels, but most of them have been of lower quality than the original. Modern sadistic horror director Rob Zombie made his remake of this classic in 2007. Following its success, he released a sequel in 2009. Following the original release of Halloween, there came Nightmare on Elm Street, Friday the 13th, and others. Following this trend, as we move into the 1980s, we begin to see an onslaught of sequel horrors. Movies in which the main villain, or in some cases such as The Evil Dead, the protagonist, hardly ever are really as dead as they seem they should be. Movies such as Child's Play turned into a franchise that would span decades. Typically, these sequels fed off of the success of the original film and were nowhere near as good of quality or story, much like the Halloween franchise. In the 1990s, Scream brought a rebirth to the slasher film. It paid homage to earlier films of the genre, referencing them through a series of questions that the killer would ask his victim before murdering. Scream also introduced the idea of rules to the horror movie. Its success brought on 3 sequels. Together, the entire franchise made gross at the box office $331 million. As we roll into the new millennium, we find a horror audience whose senses are more dulled to the blood and violence of your typical slasher film. A new set of low-budget horror scarefest films begin to be embraced by horror fans, containing unheard of human suffering and violence and pushing the limits of the R rating. These films gain descriptions such as pseudo-snuff films, horror porns, and pornography, just to name a few. At the top of the list of these films we find the Saw franchise. Boasting a box office gross of over $416 million, it will continue to be a lucrative franchise with the possibility of endless retreads and side stories, as we have already begun to see it adapt. It is now the most successful horror franchise of all time, and unlikely to lose its place at the top anytime soon.